It's July 22nd, 1992, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
So it's today in history in 1992 that Colombia entered a new and far more dangerous phase of its long struggle with the drug kingpin Pablo Escobar, the man who had once offered to pay off Colombia's national debt, who had bombed civilian airliners, assassinated judges and politicians, and turned the country into the epicenter of the global cocaine trade, walked out of a prison that was never quite a prison.
Yeah, because this was La Catedral, as it was known, and it was personally built for Escobar by Escobar during his negotiated surrender to the Colombian government. Basically, house arrest, but if you also got to build the house. And actually, from its location, which was in the hills outside Medellín, he could see his own house in the city. It was nicknamed Hotel Escobar or Club Medellín. Escobar had total control over the construction, and eventually the complex would include a football pitch, a swimming pool, jacuzzi, a sauna, several bars with big screen TVs, pool tables, and the whole place was filled with designer furniture, paintings, and imported luxury food and drink.
Yeah, he was taking the piss. And, you know, it got to the point where 13 months earlier, when he'd surrendered to the authorities as the world's biggest drug kingpin and a massive bounty on his head, we get him in prison. Let's just give him whatever he wants on the condition that he remains in Colombia rather than being extradited to the United States. It might have seemed like quite a good deal. You know, he can build his own house, he can stay in his palace, we won't be involved in it, and we can say that he's in prison. But he carried on his business operations. There was telephone, there was modem, there was a fax machine. And in this year, 1992, he had ordered the murder of several opposition cartel leaders, along with their entourages and their families. And really, at that point, it was a national embarrassment for Colombia that even though he was in prison, he was still continuing his operations. There had been no noticeable decline in the cocaine trade at all because he was still doing his business. And so they couldn't allow him to so flagrantly carry on. And that was why on this day, they attempt to move him to a proper prison, an army barracks jail. And that's what got completely botched.
By the early 1990s, Escobar was already this global symbol for narco-trafficking power, and as the head of the Medellín cartel, he'd built up this huge network of cocaine export and shipping, and he was now taking industrial quantities of the drug into the United States and beyond. And that's why, first, Colombia wanted to clip his wings. It's also why the United States wanted to get their hands on him. But at the height of his power, his organization was reportedly generating billions of dollars annually, giving him access to everything that he kind of still had at his fingertips once he was in this notional prison. He had his private armies, he had his political influence, and he had these vast patronage networks that were still answering to him, so much so that when he called for these two people who had notionally been working for him, who he thought were stealing from him, to be brought up to La Catedral, they came willingly to answer to their boss, and he could also do entirely with them as he pleased. But the fact that he could do that in the confines of what was meant to be a jail was this huge embarrassment for Colombia. It was a symbol of state weakness. And so they really did feel like now was the time they had to act.
Yeah, and I mean, they did know from the start that the way that Escobar was living was not really compatible with being a prisoner. I should mention that his brother Roberto and some of his closest lieutenants were also imprisoned alongside him. So, you know, it really was basically just the headquarters of the cartel at that point. One police report showed that in the first 3 months of his so-called detention, he received more than 300 unauthorized visits, including from wanted criminals and from celebrities. He even hosted a wedding reception in his disco. But all of these details were kept hidden from the public. This stuff wasn't being reported because the government was trying to push this message of, you know, we got him. But even so, the attitude of Colombians was still kind of ambivalent, because although Escobar was responsible for countless murders, kidnappings, bombings, he was also seen by many people.
I mean, say countless, but like more than thousands. Yeah.
And including, you know, the airline bombing had killed US citizens. That was why he was wanted in the US as well, among other things. But he was seen by a lot of people, especially in Medellín, where he was from, as a Robin Hood figure, because he did invest millions and millions of his cocaine dollars in infrastructure in the city, especially in the poorest neighborhoods, you know, building schools, hospitals, sports stadiums. So I think
cocaine laboratories, you know, all the infrastructure everyone needs. Yeah.
Cocaine warehouses. You know, but this is sort sort of the reason that the Colombian government did turn a bit of a blind eye was that La Catedral was more about protecting Escobar from being assassinated by rival gangs or extradited to the US or, any manner of things. There were plenty of people who would have wanted to get hold of him. And that hillside location was chosen specifically because it was difficult to assault. It was foggy for most of the day and it was in quite a remote, hard-to-access area. There wasn't even an armory inside the compound with firearms for Escobar in the event that he came under attack.
Yeah, just before he handed himself in, there was increasing pressure from a vigilante group named Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, who were pursuing him and eventually would assassinate more than 300 of his associates and family. So he actually wanted to be in prison and to know that he was in a secure facility. And actually that panic room thing, the fact that they had all these, installments around the facility in which he could hole himself up, was something that he used on this day to divert attention from where he really was. We worked out later that he walked through the back door, but on the day there was speculation he might have literally walked through the front door. But anyway, he then called up on the police radio and said, "No, I'm hiding in a panic room." And so was the sort of integrated corruption between the state and his drug cartel. That's where they started to look for him, in the panic rooms of the prison, which of course gave him many more hours to get out. And he had walked through the back door with the help of the guards, to whom he didn't pay a peso. He distracted the police and went far enough away that for the rest of his life he was on the lam.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that even though on one level he'd been put into this gilded cage and life for him could sort of continue with his visitations by friends and lovers and football teams and wedding guests and all the rest of it. But still, his networks began to crumble a bit because once he was on the run, he started to move between a series of safe houses in and around his home city of Medellín and calling on the same loyal family members and bodyguards and sympathizers to provide him with shelter and money and communications that he always had. But although he had once commanded this huge army of soldiers, frankly, his organization had weakened since he went into La Catedral, and many of his associates had been killed or arrested or had begun distancing themselves from him, or even, like the two men he ultimately murdered in La Catedral, they all started to kind of do their own thing of building their own power centers. And so seeing that weakness, the Colombian government then reactivated this elite search block. It was a special police unit that they then used in conjunction with US intelligence to try to start to track him down. And basically, their goal at this stage was simple. They wanted to find him before he could rebuild his organization. And so the search block started raiding safe houses across Medellín, and gradually they dismantled the network of couriers and accountants and bodyguards that kept him hidden, all the while closing the noose around him.
Yes, but it was a strange kind of cat and mouse game because on one hand you had this elite special force, about 600 operatives, looking for him, but at the same time he was constantly in communication with the Colombian authorities because he had the same problems that he had had before he went into La Catedral. He had a lot of enemies, a lot of rivals, a lot of people who would have liked to have seen him dead. So he wanted to be in safety. He wanted to be basically wanted to be back in La Catedral, I think, was his ideal scenario. So he kept getting in touch with them, trying to negotiate a surrender. But the problem was that, as you were alluding to, Arian, the longer he was on the run, the less control he had over his empire. And so the power balance was now not really in his favor in those negotiations. So the Colombian government felt pretty comfortable at this point not negotiating with him further. And, they'd already given him this incredibly sweet deal and he had walked or rather run away from it. And now he was no longer in command. That was becoming really obvious that power was slipping away from him. And so they just ignored him and he ended up moving from place to place. And the only way that they could keep track of him was via phone tapping. But he was also onto them and he knew that if he kept calls to less than 2 minutes, they wouldn't have time to trace where they were coming from. And it wouldn't be till he eventually would slip up on that phone tapping and he would linger on the phone because he was a family man. I have to say what you want about Pablo Escobar. He was very much in touch with his family the whole time. And it was in the end his affection for his family that led him to spend that fatal extra time on the phone that allowed the authorities to close in on him.
Yes, an early example of telephonic triangulation with United States operatives involved. Members of the US Delta Force and Navy SEALs joined a 600-member Special Operations Unit of the National Police of Colombia as they tried to find him during this 18 months on the run until eventually, even though there was a $6 million bounty offered for his capture from members of the public, no one obliged, possibly because of those acts of altruism we referred to earlier, the police did catch up with him on the 2nd of December 1993 and shot him dead.
Well, that's the official version, that the search block officers had surrounded the building, and Escobar and his bodyguard then tried to escape across the rooftops, and then this firefight broke out. The official version says that he was shot dead, but there is some speculation that he might have taken his own life. The idea in his head, and he'd said this out loud, was that basically he would, quote, rather have a grave in Colombia than a jail cell in the US. So he didn't want to be taken alive. But I mean, coming back to the business of his, like, what a family man he was, while he was on the run, he reportedly burned $2 million in order to keep his daughter warm. So he just had so much money when, like,
that's just
at
what he
his
had
peak.
to hand, though.
Yeah, well,
Anything.
that's all. Like, yeah, it probably actually was that he just had these bags of cash. I mean, according to his own brother, about 10% or $2.1 billion of his fortune was written off annually just because it was eaten by rats or destroyed by the elements, or in some cases just lost. Like, this guy was so rich. And yeah, so that business of there being a $6 million bounty on his head, that is pocket change for him, plus all of the risk. Like, there's so many reasons why you wouldn't dob in Pablo Escobar, but like, the money alone was not worth it, let alone the people who would come after you if you'd done so.
Yeah, in 1989, at the peak of his cartel, he was estimated as being the 7th richest man in the world. He was making $500 million per week.
Well, since 2007, La Catedral has been a Benedictine monastery, although I couldn't find any word as to whether they've kept the disco room or the jacuzzi.
Kept all the coke, though.
Tomorrow.
No, it was 3:45 because you were with my accountant and a couple of girls, and I was like, ugh.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.